We're heading towards the afternoon. I know that this next panel is the one you've all been waiting for. The whole of yesterday, last night, and this morning, the curiosity around population growth, what to do, how to contain it, whether to thrill at it. This has been the great delight of the conference. I just want to make one or two introductory remarks before we get into the substance, and I bring up my esteemed panel of co-thinkers. First of all, to say that it's been a huge honor for me to work with the Africa Philanthropy Forum in London. There are, as you will know, for those who live here on the continent, there are millions of Africans dispersed across the UK, Europe, way out into what we might call the East and the Far East. And we've held a number of meetings at KPMG offices over the last year, and we're holding a strategy session with the Philanthropy Forum in September, helping to think about the future. And one of the things that's really important to me as someone who has a mixed African heritage, a father from Angola and a mother half Ghanaian, is that I firmly believe that if we're going to bring the wealth of Africa to the continent, could we bring also the wealth of Africans dispersed to the world back to the continent? And that would be a release of many, many, many billions of additional investment resource, not just philanthropic gift dollars or euros or better still pounds, but resource that comes back to this continent to enable everything we said about health and education and progress to take place. Just a further reflection, which is we've heard a lot over the last 2 days, still looking at Western countries for aid and connection. And I've encountered many, many thousands of not just well-meaning people from Singapore and Malaysia and China who are fascinated, and India fascinated by the opportunities that are here in Africa, but also many Africans who live around what we might think of as the East. So if we begin to shift our mindset away from North America, Europe, traditional European aid, and away into different places where the investment in this continent could become so much more vivid. And why is it so important? Well, it's so important because we are facing a phenomenal population explosion. It all depends on how you want to think about it. We heard just yesterday that we're sort of 6,000 days off until we get to around just over 2,100, 2050-ish. And then we look at the world's population will have grown from about 7.5 billion to nearly 10 billion. In terms of that growth, half of the growth is going to be here in this continent. And with that half of growth being here in this continent, the numbers in particular of young, school-age young, are going to be booming. Not out of all reason, but just booming. And so that raises all the questions about education capability, readiness for work, the skills that are necessary. I noticed on South Africa's Broadcasting Corporation News this morning, I'm sure you were all up eagerly watching it as I was, but I noticed on the news this morning that the last quarter unemployment rate here amongst young workers in South Africa has gone up to 27.6% from 26.1% in the last quarter. So if we're going to face a booming big population, where the numbers of children and young are especially most intensely to be noted. An assessment by UNICEF, which I'm vice president of in the UK, says that this continent is going to need roughly 6 million more doctors and roughly 6 million more teachers if just the basics of healthcare and quality education are to remain somewhat consistent. I want to quote you just a quote from the former Nigerian President Obasanjo, who said in an interview in a piece that is a reflection of data that has come from UNICEF, he said these words: "A youth explosion will not be localized, it will be global. It will cut across religion, it will cut across tribe and ethnic area, it will cut across geographical areas, it will cut across social areas, it will be a mess." And while we sit here in South Africa, in Johannesburg, you'll all know that the numbers of African migrants pushing their way through the Mediterranean towards Europe is on an increasing curve, roughly around 190,000 in the course of the last 12 months. And in the last 6 years, 68,000 have perished in the Mediterranean. We know the numbers of those who have died from bodies recovered and the source where they came from and the reasons why people have come up through Niger and up into Libya. And now the latest route that was just revealed, not just those heading to Italy and France, but those heading up from Morocco directly up to the edge of Spain and even around to Gibraltar. This push of desperate young Africans seeking a better life. So here on the continent, the population is going to boom. Some say the population of Nigeria will go from 200 million roughly now to 400 million by 2150. If that is the case, that's a lot of emails to look forward to, asking for help. The Nigerians in the room will recognize that habit. But if you take it seriously, just in terms of one country alone on this continent having a greater population than the whole of the EU put together, or the United States. Now, in some places like China, of course, we got used to the one-child policy. That was something that old people like me used to remember back in the 60s and 70s. Now China wants a two-child policy because they need to boost their numbers. As numbers are beginning to decline in China, India is facing similar caps on population by deliberate design, whereas here in Africa, the population is escalating consistently. So is this a macro threat? Is this a serious ongoing problem? Is this an opportunity? Is this a golden moment? What is this? How should we think about it? And I'm going to ask a wonderful panel to come and join me. So I'm going to ask, first of all, Sibongile, if she would come on up. Sibongile is the chief executive of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. Now, I wanted her to come up first, and she's not been prepared for this, but I just thought we couldn't pass this moment if we didn't recognize, because I know you probably wouldn't have plunged into her CV, but if you didn't recognize that President Ramaphosa gave her an award recently for her decades of fighting against apartheid, including in 1976, supporting the student uprisings. But also, and here in the citation it read, for her excellent contribution to the well-being of South Africa's children. Bongli, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the history of what you did back in the 70s?
Do you want me to say?
Sit down, go on.
I'm terrified. I mean, it's bad enough that I'm talking to Lord Hastings. But what did we do? I think I did what I'm doing today. Organizing, mobilizing, agitating. I'll continue probably to do that till my last day.
Yes. Excellent. It's good to see you in such good health. Well, we're going to go back to the tall people, so I've got two very tall people to come and join us. Amadou Fall, who is the MBA Vice President and Managing Director for Africa. You see, you just thought they were on the last panel. Here they come. Amadou also has a foundation, Sports for Education and Economic Development, of which he is founder. Another tall person, Norman Moyo.
Hello.
See, we have to stretch the definitions.
Congratulations. You're tall, eh?
I'm very tall.
Norman is Chief Executive. Am I saying it right? Kumi Technologies. He's also been awarded many times for being one of the most astute 40 under 40 with a Titans of Influence Award. And we're going to come back to that conversation with you. And Kareem Abdul, where is Kareem? Kareem here. We're back to the tall guys. Kareem Abdul Jabbar, who is also a basketball player from the US. I think we have a running theme in this conference. Now, I have one more very important member of our panel, and this is David. David Herke Ludovic, who is also country director for UNICEF here in South Africa. David has had a long history of working with the United Nations, UN organizations on these themes. So, David, I'm going to start with you because I quoted from UNICEF information. As you look at, because you're UNICEF director for South Africa, but of course you've worked right across the continent and you've worked on disaster response, recovery, children's care needs. As you look at the issue of what is going on in Africa's population explosion, are you troubled? Are you excited? Are you thinking, pause, but how do we pause?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're on.
It's someone spanning between excitement and worries. I think the issue of whether it is a paradox or not, whether it is an asset or a liability, it really depends on the choices that we will be making today. And the conversation yesterday and today about the need to invest in education, the need to invest in health, but also the need to invest in allowing young people to acquire the skills that we need for tomorrow. And I'm very glad that Norman is here because we've had a long conversation about this. If I look at my country, Mali, I'm going to take an example. If we had made better choice 20 years ago, when we were dealing with climate change, food insecurity, conflict, and have really made sure that women and young people were giving preference in the way we invested, we may not be in the situations that we are today. So we have across the continent vivid example of what can happen if we do the right thing, or what will happen if we don't invest,
So when you say the right thing, what is the right thing? When you refer to Mali and then you think of here?
For me, the right thing is, first of all, to make sure that we consolidate the gains that we made during the MDG period. And the MDG was very mechanical somewhat in terms of getting results, but we needed that. So how do we consolidate the gains made from the Millennium Development Goals and use those gains, to make sure that the young people, and as we heard this morning, women are fully involved in the SDGs. And I think the second aspect is the fact that we have an opportunity that we didn't have before. Corporate, private sector, high net worth individuals have a keen interest to invest in sustainable development. That's a change in the mindset that I've seen over 3 decades. A decade ago, very little corporates or high net worth individuals were interested in sustainability. They were interested in charity. We have a completely different discourse. So how do we leverage that, to invest in the young people and to invest, as all of you said this morning, in women, because that's where we will be able to fast track the results that we...
So are you suggesting, because the current rate of birth per woman is still at 5.6 children per person, and are you suggesting that if there was a deeper dive investment into the Sustainable Development Goals, in other words, better quality education, women would choose to have fewer children? Is that where you're going? Or
Yes.
Are you... Go on.
Yes, and I was sharing with my colleague from UN Women yesterday an example of what happens when some countries are in conflict or in political tensions and schools are closed. Mm-hmm. So we see the closing of schools, like in Mali, 750 schools are closed right now. We see that from an education standpoint, but it's got a very serious longer-term impact. Because in many of these countries, in social settings, when I'm a dad and somebody comes and says, I want to marry your girl, my answer can be, why don't you wait until she finishes school? Now, if you are in a situation where the schools are closed, that father or that mother no longer have the options or the opportunity to say, why don't you wait? So I suspect that, I argue that the closing of schools and many other social facilities across the continent, it is critical that we make sure that we reopen those schools and we reopen those health centers. Otherwise, you will have a rise in teenage pregnancies, you will have a rise in early marriage, and you will have a transfer of social norms and social values that may not necessarily match what the continent needs.
Norman, David paints this as like state provision schools and clinics and basic education. When you think about the role of business and the skilling that is needed, this fast booming youth population, do you add to that perspective, or do you have a different perspective?
I think I would add it to the perspective. I'll probably, because from a business point of view, we look at population as a great asset. It's not a liability. And if I was sitting here 10 years ago, I probably would have a bit of nervousness around that statement, but not today. The technology that we have seen in this continent, and by the way, in telecoms, we lead the world in terms of innovation, in terms of harnessing and embracing technology and using it to permeate all the way down to the lowest person in the continent. We've got tele-density where most of your Africans have got mobile phones in their hands now. But we also have invested significantly in this fiber capacity across the continent, broadband, all these things. So things that would have concerned me 10 years ago are no longer a concern for me. Can I create employment in Africa? Certainly, using just the technology.
But how? Just be specific.
So I've been working, so we've been spending a lot of time together. So we believe using technology today, we can take care of most of the young girls and be able to put them in a job just using their mobile phone. Today, we already have got a program that we're working towards creating 1 million young students to just do research. You'll be amazed, every corporate in Africa today, every company, you give me the name, they need to do certain researches every month, if not every day, to understand how their consumers operate. So we've got a platform. We've built a platform like Uber. So you Uberize some of these services. We put that platform here, and we recruited around 100,000 kids. And we said, we'll release you to go and do research for Coca-Cola, Unilever, and the works. Coca-Cola loves that because all of a sudden, these young kids who were actually loitering in the street yesterday, now we've got a mobile phone, and they can go to an outlet, and they can actually do a stock management for Coca-Cola. They can do a brand survey for Coca-Cola. They can do a lot of services. And I pay them. For every time they press the button submit, I actually pay them money. So we now know whether it's skills, hard skills such as installations, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's fiber to home deployments, whether it's education, pure education. We've got a platform in Zimbabwe today with nearly 1 million students who are accessing education through their mobile phone. So it is now possible, it is now more, I'm no longer concerned as I was before. Maybe 5 years ago I would have been a bit nervous, but today we should embrace this as probably one of the biggest opportunities the continent has, because population, it can be your half glass is empty, half is full. In our case, it's half full.
But you're suggesting that this booming numbers of young men and women coming into the African population norm, many who want to be urbanized and come to the cities, that technology can scoop them all up, that jobs will be created sufficiently. But the contrary evidence to that is that what is really needed across this continent is a re-energizing of agriculture and a love for the land. But that, I mean, there are technological solutions to farming, but frankly, it's a kind of hand graft.
And I'll respond to that with a case study. So if I put a mini grid, you know what a mini grid is, right? A 100 kilowatt system in a community in Africa, any of these, we call them growth points in some parts of Africa, where there's no electricity today. There's probably a school, a primary school and a secondary school, and school teachers. There's also a clinic at that community center, and there is some villagers in the surrounding area. I will only make one investment, a 100 kilowatt system, which we are actually doing. But let me tell you the spillover effect of that 100 kilowatt system. First, I'm connecting all the schools, and don't worry, they can afford it. Secondly, I am creating a chain of farmers in that community who are going to be farming, whether it's potatoes, sweet potatoes, which is my favorite, obviously, tomatoes, and whether they are actually doing poultry. And you'll be amazed how much farmers I can create by just that one system. But let alone that, I'm also going to make sure that there's broadband, because I already have towers in that place, so I'll just upgrade one of my towers into a 4G tower. So I'll be able to provide broadband connectivity there, and I'll leave an internet cafe. Should I continue? There's also health. So I'm going to leave a health center there, which could not be done till today, because I did not deploy that 100 kilowatt system. And I don't need actually to do this as a social service. You'll be amazed when I create these young entrepreneurs, They are very happy to pay $50 every month to get power.
Well, that is brilliant. I mean, that is optimism we need to hear, because that is beginning to respond to what could be labeled a demography crisis, but instead you're saying it's a booming opportunity. Let me just ask Amadou, you traverse the continent, being super tall and playing basketball and facilitating basketball. What do you see amongst the young in terms of the desire for work and the need for work and this booming youth population?
I talk about it, and moved back here in 2010 after 21 years in the US, having had the opportunity to move there, play basketball in college, and just the opportunity we have on this continent to really use sport, and for us basketball particularly, as a tool to keep these young people engaged in positive endeavors. Everywhere we go, from Dar es Salaam to Lagos, to Dakar, Casablanca, where we launch our programs, focusing on how do we use the values of our game to impact the positive mindset on these young people and see them respond, and how hungry they are for life and for contributing to the development of our continent. This is why, for me, it is, it is always challenging to, hear about. Obviously, we got to talk about, the possibility of this population bulge being a liability if we don't harness it in the right way. But I think if our leaders and all of us here in the room, and I think having platforms like this, connecting people from different sectors to talk about ways to engage this young population, to make sure that world-class quality education is affordable to our youth across the continent. That is exciting. That is exciting. I see, to answer your question, when I see these young people from all across the continent, I know that if they are engaged, they wouldn't trek through the Sahara Desert to go to Libya or the shore of the Mediterranean to perish there. The opportunities is huge, and I think, for me, the bias that we have in sports is because I've seen it over and over. We saw on the panel before, Serge Ibaka learning from his big brother, Dikembe Mutombo. Dikembe Mutombo learning from giants like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who went to UCLA, he's the NBA's all-time leading scorer. But he's not just giant on the court, but what he's done, his role in the civil rights movement in the US, inspired African Americans in the US to really believe that anything is possible. He grew up in Harlem, USA. So those are the same role models that we are seeing here, on the continent, with the likes of Lual Deng and Dikembe Mutombo, who built his hospital. Serge now, following in his footsteps. We have a young man from Senegal who is passionate about agriculture, as you talked about it, and he's farming. He's a passionate farmer. He is using his God-given talent and the resources he's able to earn in the NBA to come back and invest in his community, creating jobs for these young people. So I think, for me, it's a great opportunity to keep these young people engaged in positive social activities, and that's going to drive our continent forward.
So you're an optimist too?
Absolutely. I mean, I've lived it. I stumbled literally on basketball, and that's what took me to the US, and I saw what it did for me. We came back and tried to replicate it with other young people, hundreds of them, and I see them coming back and doing it for others. There is a ripple effect that is happening.
So Bongi, when you hear this optimism, does this match with your experience?
I'm extremely optimistic about Africa and about our children and about where we are and our young people. I'm pessimistic about our capacity to respond to their challenges. I think we're extremely challenged, and I think we're trying. It's like sitting today. If we're sitting today 20 years ago, we would not have imagined how social media would have transformed communication. So sitting here today, for me, it demands that we can't project ourselves. We need to enable young people to get into the space and help us understand what the future looks like. Because one, we have created the problem we have, because as we sit here, we have a number of young people, too many, 26% in South Africa, unemployed and probably unemployable because we've looked at them as workers. Whereas the day-to-day, which is what they face, they don't face an environment that requires them to be workers. The earlier discussion comes into play. They face an environment that requires them to be problem solvers. So their thinking should be different. But the school system we've subjected them to is the school system I had. And the fact that we're still taking children whose world and lives are so different through exactly the 12 years of schooling that starts exactly the same way that it started for all of us, it says there's a problem with our capacity to imagine what could be different. If we can imagine how different 20 years was, even just 20 years was from where we are today, we would probably be able to respond to younger people. And that does require a little bit less age at policy level and a little bit more young people at policy level, so we can be able to respond to the big opportunity we have, because I'm quite convinced that the rest of the world has a human capital plan based on Africans coming to them. Africa, I don't think it has a solid human capital plan. And the fact that we don't have a plan, all of us have little ideas of what we could do, is problematic. Because actually, as we sit here and philanthropists have the lever to force everyone around to the same table to have a conversation about the challenges we will face between now and then. So they are not a problem, but we are already, when we were dealing with HIV and AIDS, we were behind the curve. We were chasing right behind the curve. It took us a while, and treatment had to come for us to go ahead of the curve. We're sitting again at the same place, far behind the curve. The problem is already here. The fact that we have the numbers, we can project the numbers, but we have 26% unemployment already says that we haven't responded in the manner in which we should have responded. And that questions the capacity, the flexibility of our institutions, be they institutions of learning, be they government, all our institutions.
So if I can get you to be specific then about the redesign, because what you said is essentially things are being done today the way they were done 30 years ago, and the world has changed, and technology has driven different opportunities. But if we were to look at the way in which Eastern economies have boomed and managed their populations, they have a much earlier intervention, particularly in maths and science, from the ages of 3 to 4, where children are learning the hard disciplines of what the future looks like. So what would you literally do? You have the Minister of Education here in South Africa sitting right there. What would you literally do?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Minister. I love that opportunity. I'd love the opportunity because, I know maths and science, but I have a feeling that the future requires common sense. The future requires thinking. We are training our children. It's almost like I'm sitting here today and the apartheid government is setting up the education system. It trained people to be workers. The challenge, Minister, is not how many employees you're going to create. It's how many problem solvers, thinkers, creators of new possibilities are we going to have. That means, whilst we still continue with our emphasis on maths and science, we also bring in philosophy, history, geography. Children sometimes don't even know where they are. So we need to bring in those things that are called humanities, because even technology is said to be value neutral. It's not value neutral. It will absorb the values that we teach. So if we get into a society where there are no values, it's kind of value neutral, we are going to get probably some of our worst criminals in society, unless we go back to what are the values that would underpin a technological response. What is the value that underpins Facebook? We saw it on trial at the time. And we saw the values that underpin the system being questioned against democratic values. So I would say to the minister, we actually, at this point, we are probably too old in this room. We need a new group of people in this room to help us design the kind of education we need. The classroom is probably the only place that still looks the same from 1920. If I go to a hospital and I go to a theater, it looks very different from a theater in 1920. Because it says we've transformed. So I mean, the classroom is exactly the same. Schools are exactly the same. Where you have a difference, it's just the tip of the pyramid. It's too few to make a difference. We need a massive difference, which means that Africa has to self-determine. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, but those goals need also to be driven by a particular ideology and philosophy in the continent.
Now, Karima, as you hear this, you hear this optimism but anxiety at the same time, the need for radical transformation. What lessons would you draw from, say, your experience in the US that we could apply here?
Well, I think it's a much different type of situation in the U.S. because in the U.S. there's so much abundance, and the problem there is people want to deny people access to the things that they need because they don't like their ethnicity. They don't like their religious background. It's not that the whatever is needed isn't there in abundance. It's this group can't have it because for some reason they're not acceptable. Black Americans have dealt with that for 300 years. So that's the problem there. It's not a lack of what is needed. It's a lack of the desire to share and accept the humanity and citizenship of all the people in the country. They want to debate who's more worthy or who's less worthy. You see people trying to enter our country nowadays and applying for asylum, and the government decides which people are deserving of being treated equally. That's what we're dealing with, and that is a very difficult problem because it's intractable. It has to do with people's feeling of superiority and their inability to accept the humanity of all the people who need this help.
But one of the themes of this conference, too, has been that there is also abundance here in Africa. There is a lot of abundance here in South Africa. There is a greater differential between the extremely rich and the extremely poor here in South Africa, more than any country in the world. So in order to, and here in a conversation about philanthropy, in order to get this addressing of both the mix between technology, opportunity, education, sports support, would you have a message for Africa's wealthy, some of whom are sitting here, so you can eyeball them? Would you have a message for them about, the lesson from the US is stop being so...
I think the lesson is believe in what can be done here and invest in that. Build the roads, build the hospitals, build the schools, so that the communication within the countries and between the countries can be facilitated. And when Africans start sharing their resources and the incredible amount of intellectual power that they have here, when they focus that on developing the resources that they have here, Africa's going to take off. But until that happens, other interests will come and try to siphon off all of the positive potential and just leave Africa with the miserable part of it, the undevelopment that happens when people have directed everything away from the source, away from this country, where all of its assets should be used to develop here.
So 4 billion Africans is not a threat to America.
Why should it be? America has its own resources. The whole idea is to share resources and knowledge so that all of us can proceed forward, because humanity will not proceed forward until we can accept each other and work together.
So, Norma, when you hear the conversation around the redesign of the education system to be adaptable to what you're describing, what would you say to the education minister?
I probably would start slightly above the education minister if I had my way.
We can help with that.
President Ramaphosa is sitting right there.
Thank you. And the reason being, we always say, no stream can rise above its source. And as a continent, we have got a certain source that we have created. It starts here. I mean, that stream can only start from here, right? So, and here for Africa is not working. So you were asking for, we sound a lot of positive message or optimism. There is some dose of reality that says we don't have the right caliber of leadership in Africa to be able to achieve even some of these conversations. I'm excited she mentions the issue of education. I was actually talking at Stellenbosch yesterday, and I was saying exactly that the school today has not changed. If, as a marketing person, and you are my marketing director, and you show up in my office with a plan that looks like what it looked like 4 years ago, I'll fire you on the spot because you don't know what you're talking about. But we've got schools that look like 40 years from where they are, and we say we have a problem. So the Minister of Education, I'll jump one level above, and I want to talk to the presidency, or if I was the president of Africa, I want to address things at that level.
That's what you need.
And I'll summarize it this way. I think the platforms are now available. Africa is not short of skilled, highly skilled manpower. We've got a lot of corporate executives that are running these corporates superbly, whether it's in the continent or even globally. We've got a lot of Africans doing it today. But we don't have them coming in, or we don't have a platform for them to work with the governments in power today. We need to create that platform so that we capacitate the president and the Minister of Education. He means well, she means well, but she can only do so much. Some of the leadership skills we need are not residing in government.
No.
They actually reside in the corporate sector, and we need to bring them out.
Do you think the implication, and I'm looking to you as well, David, do you think the implication of what you're all saying here is the need to deconstruct the skills development of the future away from the state and more towards the opportunities of the private sector delivering? I mean, as UNICEF and obviously as a UN man where the institutions of government have been so much a priority always, but the government is clearly failing on the delivery of the new means, the new skills, the new methods.
Do you want me to engage the minister or the president?
Well, this is the president of Africa.
No, I think there was a very important meeting in Nairobi a few weeks ago, partly sponsored by UNICEF, on decolonization of the education system in Africa. So the conversation has already taken place. Governments are aware that something needs to change radically from the bottom, both in terms of even the way school infrastructures are designed, to the way the curricula is being put together. So, yes, you're speaking to somebody who's absolutely convinced that we need to listen to the private sector, we need to listen to the young people. I can share the example of my 12-year-old boy, who the other day I said, why don't you ask he was struggling with an equation, and I asked him to go and look at it on the internet. And he said, the problem is I don't know yet the question I'm going to ask the internet. So you see, this is happening already among the young people. I think organizations such as the UN and UNICEF, in particular, we will have to catch up with the fast pace of change. We need to be a lot more agile and change our listening also, because we tend sometimes to have pre-cooked solution. The whole issue of child participation can move to the next level. In terms of making sure that, in our offices, all UN, why should we bring young people once a week in our office just to interact with us and say, what are you doing for us today? Are we ready as UN officials and experts to answer that question once a week, 52 weeks a year? I think we will learn a lot from that kind of interaction.
So let's open it up to you for comment and question. You don't have to ask a question. You could give a solution instead. Who wants to go first? Gentleman at the back. And next, who wants to get another microphone? There's a gentleman here, and then, right at the very back. Okay. We're coming to you later.
Hi, Frank Oswani. Lord Hastings, just first of all, point of correction, the unemployment rate of youth in South Africa is over 50%.
I was talking about South Africa's.
Oh,
rate.
South Africa is over 50%.
Yeah. Okay, right,
So,
okay.
yeah, so we're on a bigger burning platform than we imagine. And my concern, I think, we as African adults will fail our youth. We're not picking up the pace of change required to fix this problem fast enough. Bongi, you're absolutely correct. The world of jobs is elastic. The world of problem solvers is inelastic. Yet we're still producing job seekers. And we've got to take responsibility for it. And our kids are proving to us that if they're good enough, they're old enough. That panel should have someone who's under 30.
Yes.
We've got to start listening to our young people as well. And I don't think our young people are hard enough. They're seen a lot, but not hard enough.
You're right, exactly.
Yes.
That's a good, very good comment.
Yeah.
We don't need to, but we need to accept the comment and the criticism. I think there was a gentleman there who was up first. Go ahead, you've got it now, and then and then we're going to come over here. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just a quick question to the panel. Do we really have to wait for you becoming president or the minister of education to be here to change something that is so vital and fundamental as the way we educate our children today? Most people want to educate their children. If they can afford it, the children go abroad, out of the continent, and hardly come back. But if we're going to wait for the governments to do it, it's not going to be done in the time frame.
Yeah.
So how do we address something so fundamental as educating the continent's children?
Okay, we'll come back. There's a gentleman over there. So that table, and then there was a lady over there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Max. I'm with UN Environment. Just two comments I wanted to make. I'm so glad that most of the panelists and previous panelists as well have mentioned the importance of rediscovering our distance as a beacon for where we're going. Because I do think that empathy and compassion are going to be very important for the future. And the jobs of the future that will be at a premium are those that require a lot of empathy. Machines are learning to do most of the stuff that we're doing right now. But there are certain things that machines won't learn. So I think that's very important that you're putting that at the top of your education thing. Second point is, I work for the UN and I see the conversations happening in the UN in a different way. And I would say, what's surprising for me is that even in the UN, we're saying, what can we learn from the private sector? Or what can we learn from civil society? So I do think that the conversations we're having here are happening in the right space, actually. Let's not wait for the UN to get ahead of the conversation or for governments to get ahead of the conversation. This is the place which will direct the future for us. Because what we say in the UN is that, look, if we're looking for transformational change, it's got to be radical in the long term, but very diplomatic in the short term. And radical is not what you find in government. Radical is not what you find in the UN. You find a lot of diplomacy in the UN, you find a lot of diplomacy in governments. And that's correct that it happens that way. But radical is what we should find here.
Yes.
So let's continue with these conversations and change this world. Let's make
you.
some good trouble.
Do you have a microphone over there?
Yes.
Right. Is there a microphone? That lady?
Yes,
Oh, there you are.
there is
Go
one.
ahead.
Hi, I'm Rutendo Renji from the African Youth Mentorship Network. Now, I hear a lot about education. I hear a lot about what we're doing and what we should be doing and outlining the problem. What I don't hear a lot about is about leadership. We're not discussing how do we groom leaders. Now, I have a passion for young people, and my program works on emotional intelligence and cultural cohesion, etiquette, branding with young boys. But I know that we've been here for 2 days now, and we've been talking about different ways of solving different problems. But we know that Africa's biggest problem isn't that we don't have resources, that we have a dearth of leadership, of emotional intelligence. And I would really appreciate if somebody spoke to that problem. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one last one here before we get a panel response. This lady here. It's coming. It's coming. Wait, it's coming. We want to hear you. Go for it. Go for it. It's right there.
I'm a former teacher, so I know how to project.
Good.
So I was on the panel earlier, and we did touch on leadership, and, let's go back to it again because we need it everywhere. And I would actually argue our kids, you know, they're the leaders we need to be cultivating. But I want to actually just throw this out in terms of just thinking about this broadly and systemically, right? Because I keep hearing it's government, it's private sector, it's, you know, I think it's all of us.
Alliances.
Like, that's the system. We are this system. So I guess I just want to like push us to think about it broadly. But then I'm also thinking about the US, which is where most of my experience has been, and seeing change and progress in some communities, low-income communities, fall apart, right? Like real progress be made in places like New Orleans and low-income communities, DC public schools. When I started teaching in the mid-90s was one of the worst, it was called, school districts in America, and is now one of the fastest growing. And a lot of that is, you know, leadership was a huge part of that. So I guess my question is about demand, right? From the people that are most impacted by the problems we're talking about. What about, how do you build demand, like in the communities themselves, so that when leadership does change, they're demanding that it sustains, right? So I think it's also, it's all ways you're coming at this, but I want to get at the demand piece.
Okay, so I'm going to let each one of the panel pick up on what they want to pick up on, but we've had clearly an emphasis that is saying, don't wait for government, the private sector, or others in partnership have got to get on with things. How do you drive and sustain demand and quality of leadership, and also the redirection of emphasis? Go, Amadou.
Yes, so to Tony's question, in terms of, you know, education, how do we approach it? And really, when we talk about leadership, for me, and to go back to Frank and how we generally do this kind of gathering, and you know, young people are not there to speak to the issues, to their issues. This is where we think, and this is maybe a bias, but for me, sports is the greatest equalizer, and I keep going back to it because, you know, it's not just because these guys are tremendously skilled athletes, whether it was Dikembe or Serge or Karim here sitting, it's because of what they do and how they conduct their lives, how they care about their community, how they understand the sense of responsibility they have to impact their communities. When we engage these young people across the continent, our message is always the same. It's really, as Madiba said, in their hands, and they have the power. You know, once we create that enabling environment to take it with them and run with the opportunity, sports instill that confidence. You know, we go back to basketball, the quintessential teamwork. Everybody would understand that what they do is critical to the success of the entire unit. Teach these young children that they have the unique opportunity and responsibility to carry the continent forward. And we give them the tool. That's where the leadership comes in. And as we talk about philanthropy here also, to be as systematic and disciplined about our approach to philanthropy as we are to commercial activities. You know, how do we start approaching this as a critical opportunity to empower our young people? Teach the right values, you know, and get out of the classroom in terms of education. It's not just what they're going to be taught in the books, and real life, you know, experience are invaluable. And that's what I see that these young people are, you know, really yearning for. So we need to present the role models that are going to continue to lead them. Dongwe?
It's very complicated, and I appreciate the sports, because part of the work we do at the Children's Fund is to ensure that we keep sports alive, sports, arts, and culture, because that keeps the agility in terms of thinking and problem solving. Leadership is crucial. How are we going to do this? I agree completely. No single sector can do it, and each sector has its strength. Philanthropy sector, I feel, has given itself the easiest job. And the easy job is to plug the gaps. That's the easy part. It needs to engage in the philosophy, the description of the problem, and the solution of the problem, and get engaged. Because often philanthropists will want to say, what is the government plan? We will support the government plan.
Yeah.
And it's not about the government plan. It's really Government is not intended to be radical. No government can be. Bureaucracy is by its nature not radical, so you're not going to achieve much out of that platform. However, civil society's role is to ask the question that nobody is asking. And philanthropist is to support civil society in asking the difficult questions and in finding the difficult answers and in creating small laboratory for ideas where ideas can, I mean, when you look, I'm telling from South African experience, it's probably the same all over the continent. The apartheid regime was a systematic, deliberate regime. It had a philosophy that underpinned it, which is why those who created it said, it will take 100 years to undo it. So unless we have 100-year plan to undo it, we haven't even started, and I don't think we have the plan.
I mean, there is clearly a sense globally that we need to accelerate results for young people if we want to have a dividend from the demographic growth. And actually, UNICEF is facilitating a global summit on the 24th of September in New York, bringing corporates from Africa and around the world, bringing governments, heads of state, civil society, high net worth individuals. And the idea of the summit is actually to launch a young people agenda reflecting the views of the many, many actors that we need to leverage in order to get results for young people. On leadership, if I can say something, I think somebody talked yesterday about servant leadership, and you don't get a PhD in servant leadership. You know, you don't get any degree actually in servant leadership. You need to accept that you may have to
You get joy.
start something that your successor will get credit for, and that's where the challenge is.
Yeah.
I'd pick up on the elephant that is always in every room in Africa, and it actually looks like an elephant, and she calls it leadership. And I agree that the government, we can't sit here and expect the government to fix anything. In fact, what we've seen in telecoms is when we actually set the government aside, and when we approached the telecoms and asked to start the GSM networks, and say we want to buy your fixed line, you could be charged with treason. Today, 20 years later, if you say, can we buy your fixed line, they will even give you cousins to go with it. Yes. That's how far we have gone. We didn't wait for the government. Yeah. We went. But let me just zero in on one concept that we all can do individually as individuals in the room and as institutions in the room. I launched a platform with a group of Pan-Africans. We call it AGIP, Any Government in Power. It's AGIP Nigeria, AGIP Kenya, AGIP. I actually got the name from Nigeria 15 years when I was there. So some Nigerians will know what that means. But I loved the word. And who do we want in AGIP? We want to build 10 million Nigerians onto that platform. It's a platform. And we are going to be working with the government in power. We want the same to happen in South Africa and the same to happen in Zimbabwe. Let the conversation start to change. We, by the end of this year, when we meet next time, we will have these platforms all flourishing in the continent, and we're going to be engaging the government and giving them the skill set from the private sector. Today, there's no platform for a private sector guy to actually work with the Minister of Education. If I want to do that, they will think I want to become a minister. And I might have a very uncomfortable conversation. But we need to create a platform where everyone here can put their hands up and says, Minister of Education, I'm going to join you and become one of your technocrats. You can use my services for free. This AGIP platform will pay for that person. We want to create a platform that's got teeth, not a talking drum that just makes a lot of noise and nothing. We will not change our generation, or will not change this continent in our generation if we continue to pontificate around it. We actually need some hard actions. So that platform is open in all the markets in Africa, and people are joining up. And then we will go and work with the government in power and try to build capability with them. Right. We need to help them.
Right. Kareem.
From what I can see, all of the crises here really that have to do with leadership really are based on people wanting to get credit. And I think that when it gets to the point where no one cares about who gets credit, but what gets done, when that attitude takes prominence among all of the people who are supposed to be leaders, when they can get over who gets credit, I think a whole lot more will get done.
Brilliant. Correct. So, as we wrap up now on this, and obviously lunch comes next, is the other elephant in the room. I'm only going to ask two of you for a quick comment on this one, because we've said mass optimism about how to enable this booming population, not to be fearsome of the 4 billion, not to worry about the enormous numbers of young. There is still a movement out there that says population control is what Africa needs. So, Bongwe and David, this is very much in your territory. Where do you sit on that issue, just quickly?
Wow.
I know, little elephant.
The problem with population control is that often there's a political agenda. I think we must determine for ourselves what is good for us. We certainly have a lot to do in controlling what's going on now, because we're not talking about families. We're really talking about kids giving birth. And that's a big problem that we face, which we need to deal with.
Yeah.
That's a different problem from population control. So I think we need to understand the different problems and deal with them as we should be. Children under the age of 18 should not be giving birth. And South Africa's policy is very confused. I mean, I also just want to say we are in a country, probably a continent, that has no sense of children, has no love for children, has no vision for children. I don't know how UNICEF survives, because we don't see children. And I know we don't see children because in South Africa, we have age of consent at 16, and we say any 12-year-old can terminate a pregnancy without a parent. Now, who has an interest in terminating a pregnancy of a 12-year-old without the parent, if not the perpetrator? So there are too many complex issues for one to have a single silver lining, one answer to this question is extremely complex.
David, perspective?
25 years ago, the Population Council and a series of other organizations developed what they call the RAPID model, which was actually to present to heads of state and decision makers the impact of population growth in terms of teachers, doctors, infrastructures, and everything else. And I was privileged then to be part of some of the missions that went to present this model to heads of state. And the reaction then was, well, in 20 years we'll be dead. So there was no appetite to actually think about the future. I think that has changed radically. And as we are preparing the future, I think we need to, when we engage the leadership, we need to have a different conversation. We should say to the current leadership, if you have done this 20 years ago, this is where you will be today. Well, our model, our economic tricks and everything else is projecting the future. Well, for many of them, the future for them is the next election. So our agenda with the political leadership is not synchronized. So I think we will see, I believe we will see a slowdown as we make progress on women's education, on girls' empowerment, on economic opportunities for young people. But the demographic trend is a very, very heavy train to stop. It won't stop right away. But we need to also to be prepared for that.
Great. Well, thank you. Do thank our panel for their insights and wisdom. Thank you.